it's absolutely a legitimate target. If you have large-scale military forces on parade, they're a target wherever they are. I mean, under the laws of armed conflict, it doesn't matter where they are. If they can be engaged in aggression against Ukraine, they're a legitimate target. Um, so, I would love to see the Ukrainians attack a Mayday parade. I think it would be a wonderful thing to watch. I think it would be a great demonstration to the Russian people that Putin is weak.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today we've got a fantastic guest, former Major General Mick Ryan. Mick Ryan, former Major General in the Australian military, a commander of the Australian Defence College in Canberra, author of War Transformed and The War in Ukraine, a globally renowned analyst and a senior fellow for military studies at the Lowy Institute. Mick, great to have you on Frontline again.
Yeah, g'day, Philip. It's great to be with you.
And you're not in Australia at the minute. You're in New York, I understand.
Yeah, no, I spent a week up at West Point teaching there last week, so took the opportunity to have a short break afterwards down in the amazing New York City.
Fantastic. And West Point, what a great place. I want to get into what you've probably been talking about a little later, but today in the UK's Times newspaper, the defence editor Larissa Brown published a piece turning around and saying that Europe would struggle to collectively muster 25,000 troops as part of a deterrence force in Ukraine because its armies are undermanned and underfunded. Does this mean that Donald Trump's pressure on Europe to try and increase its defence spending and defence capability is right?
Well, I think it is right. It's the kind of conversations that friends should be having. Talking about defence spending. The way it's done obviously has not been to everyone's liking, but at the end of the day, many European countries and not just European countries, my own country, have been underfunding defence for a very long time. We've been called on it, not just by the US administration, but by our adversaries in China and Russia who've recognized it and are exploiting that.
And do you think Putin is exploiting it? Does he see this as a sign of weakness? And you mentioned China. Do you think Xi Jinping also sees this as a sign of weakness?
But there's absolutely no doubt that they do. Xi Jinping has talked for some time about the East is rising, the West is declining. He sees the underfunding of defence budgets and potentially the overfunding of social budgets to be one of the root causes for that. But I think what both he and Putin discern is a lack of will by many in Western countries to understand why you got to defend democracy. It's not the natural course of events for humans across the entire span of human history. It's something that has to be nurtured and has to be fought for. And I think they both believe that Western countries are no longer willing to do that. Now, I don't agree with that, but there is some truth to why they might believe that.
But do you think they'll be making a calculation? I think both Putin and Xi here will be making a calculation that as they see Europe start to grow and grow its defence capability, and they see America being able to disengage a little bit more, that they will find an optimal point and say, actually, if we don't do what we want to do using our military capability now, after that, things are going to get too difficult for us because the West is going to become stronger.
Yeah, I think there's a closing window of opportunity for both Russia and China. For China, it's been coming for some time. Xi's recognised that he probably only has until about 2030, because by then, countries like Japan and the United States will have more firmly focused on challenging the Chinese military coercion and aggression. And Putin's probably realised the same for a couple of reasons. One, the big aircraft carrier that is European defence spending is turning. Probably not as fast as we'd like, but it is turning. And, it takes time to step up defence spending, expand industry and the size of militaries, but it will be done within a few years. So I think Putin has a narrowing window of opportunity. The big difference between the two, of course, is that Russia is a declining power, rapidly declining power. And so the correlation of forces, correlation of economies between Europe and Russia is changing. And Putin only has a couple of years before he's done in Ukraine and won't have the capacity to challenge what will be a vastly more capable European military.
Now, looking at that capacity, whenever we see commentary on how the Ukraine war is going, very often commentators, and most of the time commentators turn around and measure it by the few hundred meters or few tens of meters that the front line has changed in the east. And forget the real successes that Ukraine has had in regaining thousands of square kilometers of territory that Russia had captured, and then holding the, on paper, second largest military capability in the world, you're virtually static for a period of time. Why do you think it is that commentators focus purely on this tactical level? Is it because there's a lack of understanding of how all the different elements of warfare come together?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of reasons. Firstly, it's what they can measure, right? And there's a lot of old sayings about you measure what you can. So it is measurable. And at the end of the day, you can't win wars if you can't win battles, but you don't win wars if that's all you're winning. And I do think much of the commentariat don't have the deep education in tactical, operational, strategic aspects of war, as well as the multi-domain, as well as the multi-agency sides of things. So they default to things that can be seen and measured. That's capturing ground on drones, largely, is what people look at, or what Trump talks about. That's 95% of the commentary on the internet and in media. And unfortunately, it misses some very important elements of warfare that are harder to measure, and you really need to spend time in the profession of arms to do that. Things like morale, things like combined arms, things like air-land integration, and things like the profound and enduring importance of humans and leadership in warfare.
And this is something I want to drill into a little bit, because you are the perfect person to do it, having commanded the Defence College. In simplistic terms, for those that don't understand the military levels, what is the difference between the tactical level, the operational level, and the strategic level, and how are they linked?
Yeah, so the tactical level really is where you are having the daily contact at the coalface between adversaries. It's the battles. It's the day-to-day operations at unit level, formation level, up to division size operations. The strategic level, I'll jump 2 levels, is really about the interface between military and politics. It's where not just militaries do strategy, but economics. It's about national resilience, about civil defence, it's about information and diplomacy. And in between there is what we call the operational level. Now, this isn't without controversy. There are some who don't think there's such a thing. I think there is, and it's enshrined in military doctrine. But it's where you link strategic outcomes with battles, and it's the art of campaigning. It's stringing together lots of battles and lots of operations, not just on the ground, but in the air, at sea, in space, in cyberspace. And it's where you really try to marry up winning battles and winning the story of the war. It's where those two kind of connect. So it's complicated theoretically, and it's difficult to do in practice. But it is an important level of war at the operational level.
But then if we look at it in practice in Ukraine terms, the lead I am seeing, and please correct me if you think there's anything different, but the lead for the operational level war is General Badanov, the head of Ukrainian HUR, and his resurgence of, again, what I describe as special operations executive type activities, whether those be with long range drones and developing that capability, whether it be assassinating Russian generals in Moscow and creating the unease that there will be in the higher level of command with regard to their security, or whether it be military industrial complexes mysteriously catching fire and then attacking the ability to continue to fund the war with the oil storage, oil processing infrastructure, and then attack military targets at depth with aircraft and all the rest of it. Do you think that Badanov is showing us a proper approach to this operational level of warfare, because it is impacting Putin's ability to continue to prosecute tactical operations? And is this something that we as Western militaries are acknowledging, learning from, starting to bring that back into our ways of thinking?
Yeah, I think he's certainly one of the key campaigns of the war. I mean, he's running a few different ones. I mean, he's running the counter Russia energy campaign, which is extraordinarily important, not just economically to degrade Russia's ability to raise funds, but psychologically for the Russian people to show them through these large-scale attacks on energy facilities as well as munitions facilities that the war isn't all going their way, that Putin is lying to them. And that's the other element of his campaigns, is put pressure on Putin to demonstrate that he is not the competent leader that he portrays himself as. But it would be unfair to say this is all Badanov, and even he wouldn't acknowledge that. In talking to him last month in Ukraine when I got to interview him, he's very open about the fact that these campaigns are highly integrated with other elements of Ukraine's security services and military. The capacity of the unmanned systems force, which has only been around since September, is extraordinarily important. They have multiple regiments of long-range strike drones, which are conducting these strikes. The Ukrainians are using intelligence from its partners like the United Kingdom and elsewhere. So whilst Budanov might be one of the figureheads of this operational level, it's done in a very integrated fashion, which, by the way, is another characteristic of the operational level of war.
Yeah, well, and again, it's the team effort. It's we look in history and we pick up and pick out particular generals for what they've achieved, but the reality is it's the team they build around them and the way that that team is coordinated. And we're getting into the leadership and the moral component of fighting power, and I think that's one of the differences there is between the way the Ukrainian military are fighting and the way the Russian military are fighting. The Ukrainians still have that and rely on that and understand to develop that moral component of fighting power, whereas the Russians don't.
Yeah, I think, if we go back to Clausewitz, he talks about the changing character and the enduring nature of war. I think most commentators and journalists want to focus on the things that are changing, whether it's drones and things like this. Whereas the reality is that's only about 10 or 15% of war. Most of it is actually things that don't change. The importance of the moral component, the importance of good leadership, the importance of fighting a war as a nation. It's not a military undertaking, it's a national undertaking. You have to mobilize people, industry, and new ideas to have at least a chance of winning a war.
Do you think what's going on around with the West having to regenerate its military capability, that we've lost a lot of what we had during the Cold War because we've been involved in other things, that people are starting to realize this again, and a focus on getting those proper elements of war fighting put into place to get the key components that really don't change throughout history? Yes, kit changes and other bits and pieces change, but we all quote Clausewitz or we quote Sun Tzu or anything else. The real essences that are together don't really seem to change at all.
No, it's the basics. One of the most basics, as I referred to, is that militaries don't fight wars, countries do. And, if you underfund the military, you're not just underfunding your ability to win on the military side of things, you're underfunding your national security. But I think there's a deeper level of understanding that's dawning. Industry, I guess, is at the leading edge of that, when it comes to the capacity to produce sufficient numbers of munitions and everything from tanks and planes to ships. We're discovering they are so complicated now, they take too long to build. But to be able to maintain all that, and I think the Royal Navy and the US Navy are at the leading edge of finding out what happens when you underinvest in your maintenance part of the ability, when you underinvest in the dry docks. I mean, the UK, the Royal Navy's nuclear-powered submarine fleet is suffering because there's been chronic underinvestment in maintenance and dry docks for about 30 years, and the US Navy is the same. But these are all still military or related to the military. I think the societal aspects is something that we have a really significant problem with. Social media and misinformation breaking down cohesion in societies. It's impacting on national resilience. It's impacting on people's understanding of the need to defend democracy and national security. So there's these broader issues in our societies that we need to address around resilience, civil defence and cohesion that are well outside the capacity of, say, the Chief of Defence Staff in the United Kingdom or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in Washington to address.
Yeah, no, it's a whole government issue that's there. But I'm glad you said what you did about the kit and all the rest of it. It's amazing how many senior admirals and air marshals and generals love to be photographed, and their politicians, the ministers, love to be photographed beside big green or grey shiny things, but don't want to be photographed by a bunker that contains hundreds of thousands of shells, because it doesn't quite give the same image. Moving back into you're looking at what's going on in Ukraine, we're getting a lot of debate at the moment around a potential peace settlement or peace deal or ceasefire. Now, Russia, America set its conditions for war. Russia's come back and turned around and said that what they want is demilitarization, denazification of Ukraine, international recognition of the complete annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, lifting of sanctions against Russia and returning frozen assets, rejection of the Russian proposal of transfer of control of Zaporizhia nuclear power plant to Washington and Ukraine, and the cancellation, and they want cancellation laws in Ukraine around the restriction of the use of the Russian language, culture and the Russian church. This seems like a capitulation plan to me, especially when we have Putin coming in and playing it with a call for a 30-hour ceasefire so that he can have a parade. Zelensky saying, I don't want a parade, let's go 30 days and take it longer, we want proper peace. And then Peskov turning around today, and I don't know whether you've seen this, but said in a press statement that peace won't come as fast as Trump wants. What are the Russians playing at here? They seem to be missing every opportunity. And how do you think Trump is going to respond?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. I think to start from the beginning, getting peace in 24 hours was never going to happen. There was zero chance of that ever happening. I said so at the start, and that's turned out to be the case. It was impossible given the distance between Ukraine and Russia and what they're after out of this war. Just physically and diplomatically impossible. So, no, and nor can they be. I mean, Putin went into this war. Remember, he's the aggressor, which many in the US administration appear to have got. Putin is the aggressor. He's unnecessarily and illegally invaded a sovereign neighbor with maximalist objectives to subjugate it, to destroy its democracy, and basically turn it into the kind of awful occupied territory that already exists where he's occupied Ukraine, where looting, torture, rape, kidnapping of children, arbitrary murder and destruction of Ukrainian cultural items is the norm, and it's systemic, and it is encouraged by everyone from Putin on downwards. So this is what the Ukrainian people look at and go, we don't want any of that. We know what it's like to live under Russia. We've been there before. All that happens is millions of Ukrainians die, and that will happen again. So they're a long way apart. There is no way that any person of good conscience can support any of Putin's objectives. Now, this then kind of confuses us about when you see Trump and Witkoff and others basically rabbiting Russian narratives about the war. And there's only two reasons that this can happen. One, they're just stupid, that they lack the intellect to understand what's going on. Or two, they're not stupid, but they're totally immoral and lack any kind of character to understand right and wrong. So it can only be one of the two, or a combination of both. The whole narrative around a reverse Nixon is ludicrous. To suggest you're going to split Russia and China when they think they're winning is just a crazy notion. And, I know there's some people who think they can do that. But, Ukraine is on the side of right. What Europe is doing to support Ukraine is the right thing to do strategically, because it's hard now, but it'll be harder if Russia wins for Europe. And I just don't see people understanding that in Washington, D.C., unfortunately.
And what message, putting your Australian hat on here, what message do you think this sends to Xi Jinping when he's looking at the potential military annexation of Taiwan or military invasion of Taiwan? Does he see America capitulation over Ukraine as a green light for him to go for it?
I think he believes he can do a deal with Trump. He's seen Trump, he steps up and then steps back, steps up, steps back. I think Xi Jinping sees an American president he can do a deal with. Xi Jinping has wanted a G2 with the United States for some time. And I think he sees a grand bargain splitting up the world between Russian, Chinese, and American spheres of influence. Now, this is highly immoral and a gross misreading of what history is. But I think he believes that is possible. And, at the same time, he's also learned from the Ukraine war just how far he can push the American administration. He's learned how this American administration makes strategic decisions, if you can call them that. And if you track his aggression in the Western Pacific and around Taiwan, it has stepped up significantly since the beginning of the Ukraine war because he's learned just how far he can go without anyone interrupting him. He's learned how brutal he can be with his neighbors without anyone intervening. So he's learned a lot from this war. And I don't see the Chinese stepping down. I see them stepping up their aggression against Taiwan. We've seen it step up significantly against Japan and the Philippines and Australia. Um, Xi seems to think he's on a winning horse. We need to convince him he's otherwise because none of us want to live under a Chinese regime.
Yeah, no, no, very much so. Now we've seen North Korea and Putin confirm that North Korean troops are on the front line fighting the Ukrainians, albeit in Kursk to start with, but they'll be in the front line in Ukraine. We've seen reports of Chinese individuals being taken prisoner of war. Are we seeing a change in dynamic in the conflict in Europe where we are getting this influence from the Southeast Asian nations coming in? And is that a worrying development?
They are. The fact that Putin is now willing to acknowledge it should worry us. If we recall, when the first reports of the North Korean troops were there, the Russians denied it, primarily because they don't want to give other countries an excuse to come in and help Ukraine defend itself. And that's been part of Putin's narrative all the way along. He doesn't want third parties intervening in the war. Well, he's chosen to have a third party come in. But he's now acknowledging it, probably because he's realised there are no third parties that have the courage to come in and help defend Ukraine. No European or American or Australian government has the moral courage to do that. So he's probably divined that we're not going to do it. And he said, well, why not acknowledge my partners? Because at the end of the day, you have this Iran, Russia, North Korea, China alignment, it's not an alliance, and it's a learning community. They are learning from each other. There's a grand adaptation war going on, and they feel they're winning it. I will say, however, generally countries who need help from North Korea are not doing well. It's not a sign of success that you are getting assistance from North Korea. So, if we dig a little bit more deeply, and the fact that Putin wants this peace agreement during his Mayday parade, because he can't guarantee it'll be secure, shows that, he's not that confident and he's playing a major bluff against the governments of Europe and the United States. If just once in this war we called his bluff, we might be in a different war, but we failed to do that.
Yeah, well, I think you and I are probably alike. If we put a 152 millimeter North Korean shell into our gun, we would want the lanyard to make it go off be at least 100, if not 150 meters long.
Yeah, probably a kilometre, I'd suggest.
Yes, and interestingly, there's reports to say that Russia is relying on, for supply of artillery ammunition, about 80% of it coming from North Korea. That does not bode well for Russia's defence industrial base. And everything that there is associated with that. But coming back into Ukraine, part of Putin's rationale behind his 30-hour ceasefire call was for the Mayday parade. Do you think the Mayday parade is a legitimate military target? And your General Badanov has only today said, I think, get your air defenders ready, or words to that effect.
It's absolutely a legitimate target. If you have large-scale military forces on parade, they're a target wherever they are. I mean, under the laws of armed conflict, it doesn't matter where they are. If they can be engaged in aggression against Ukraine, they're a legitimate target. So, I would love to see the Ukrainians attack a Mayday parade. I think it would be a wonderful thing to watch. I think it would be a great demonstration to the Russian people that Putin is weak. Now, the problem is it might also then have the Russian people join around Putin and give him more support. So you've got to be careful. You'd have to have that kind of calculus in mind where it might be like the Blitz in London. It didn't weaken the resolve of the British people, it strengthened them. And we saw the steel of the British people come out during the Blitz. That's what you don't want to do by attacking a Mayday parade.
Well, it's interesting. I was asked this morning by Ukrainian television what I thought, and I said exactly as you said. It's a legitimate military target. However, I said, "What if you're going to carry out an attack? Do it on the build-up, the rehearsals, and everything else. And whenever you've got the senior politicians and the old veterans that are there in the audience and everything else, actually, whilst it may still be legitimate." The optics of it would not be good, and therefore leave the parade itself alone. But there's plenty of forming up beforehand where you can actually disrupt the parade completely and almost make sure it never happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's that old story: win every battles, but lose the war. You could do it. You know, you have to win the war and win the story of the war, and this would have a profound impact on the story of the war for Ukraine if they were to do this. But fortunately, there's more than enough other Russian targets out there, including these, munitions arsenals that, as soon as the North Koreans ship 100 containers to them, the Ukrainians appear to be able to attack them pretty quickly, which is having a significant impact on Russia's operational tempo in eastern Ukraine.
So let's make an assumption. Russia realizes its operational tempo has been impacted. We get some form of ceasefire/peace agreement. What do you think it looks like that the coalition of the willing could be asked to do on the ground? And do you think that's militarily sustainable and politically sustainable?
Yeah, I think that the number one priority for Zelensky right from the start of the war. I remember talking to him in his palace in September 2022. Is close the skies. It's that air defense requirement, and that would be a really important contribution that European and other nations could make, is to defend parts, say, of Western Ukraine to allow them to push forward air defense capabilities. Now, that might be ground-based air defense, it might be fighter missions with a air-to-air role, or even just a AWACS kind of capability. So I think that would be an important role. The second one is training. Now, whether you do that in Western Ukraine or Eastern Poland is inconsequential, but bringing the training capability, say, like is it Operation Reflex that Australia contributes to in England? Yeah, putting that in Eastern Poland would cut a whole lot of travel time for these great Ukrainian soldiers that are being trained. And then I think the third element might be something in the Black Sea, the naval component, keeping the Russians out of the western part, but the Ukrainians seem to be doing a good job. And then the fourth element is boots on the ground. I think at some point we're going to have to seriously consider that, but that will take some kind of ceasefire, a very clear mandate, very clear command and control relationships with the Ukrainian military, and rules of engagement. That'll be a very complex mission, very doable, but there's a long way to go before we're able to do that. But none of these things should be off the table. Putin should know they're all on the table, and no amount of fist shaking or nuclear saber rattling from him should prevent us from planting these issues, at least.
It's interesting, but the question I think is, how sustainable is it over the longer period of time, not just militarily, and we've discussed how our militaries are not in as strong a position as they could be, but politically. And the thing I often quote is, whenever the United Nations put a peacekeeping force into Cyprus after what was 1974 operations in Cyprus, it was described by the United Nations as a short-term military operation, and it's still ongoing today. Do you think we have to be prepared to commit for years, if not decades, into providing capability into Ukraine? And is this going to become de facto a new Cold War?
Well, we're already in a Cold War. We have been for some time. The China's been at war with us for at least a decade. They just have a different conception of war. Russia's been at war with us for just as long. We just didn't notice. One of the common characteristics of Western countries at the moment is our politicians are very unimpressive. By comparison to other elements of society, but by comparison to their predecessors. They focus on short term. There's no moral courage in any of them, with a few exceptions. I mean, Kaya Kallas and a couple others are exceptions to that, clearly. But we have a political class that really does not want to focus on foreign affairs, on national defence, really just wants to buy votes with domestic social issues. Until that dynamic changes, it's going to be very hard for governments to take a long-term view. But at the end of the day, I mean, even the occupation force in Japan, the UN forces in Korea were not set up to last decades, but they have. And I think that's probably what we'll end up seeing in Ukraine. We'll see something that might be set up for a few years, but will just endure for some time to come, because unfortunately, we can't just tow Russia into outer space and send it on path for the sun or something like that. They're going to be there for a long time to come, and we need to protect against their aggression for a long time to come.
So something adaptable rather than something that suffers mission creep. And this is something that, you know, I'm aiming that comment at not just our senior generals and air marshals and admirals, but also our politicians. Be very careful of mission creep, because that has not been good in the past.
Absolutely. I mean, there needs to be a very clear mandate for the force, but it will also be a forcing function for the growth of military organisations, so we can rotate forces in and out. You know, it might be a 6 month or a 12-month rotation. You know, we can't do the Afghanistan thing where people were changing out every 4 months. I don't think that is a successful method. You need people on the ground getting to build relationships. But it will also be a forcing function to grow the size and capacity of our military institutions, I think, not just for Ukraine, but potentially in Scandinavia, as well as the Baltic brigades that are being deployed by, you know, UK, Canada, and Germany.
Yeah, well, we're seeing the Russian aggression moving, but you know, given the conflicts that there are around the world, and you know, this is sort of my last question really. You know, we've got the conflicts in the Middle East. We've got tensions brewing between India and Pakistan at the minute. Who's stirring that? We could debate separately. We've got Chinese expansionism across Southeast Asia, and with their Belt and Road initiatives globally. We've got, you know, is the war in Ukraine just a thorn in Trump's side because he's got more worrying fish to fry? And do you think that we are potentially on a path to global conflict?
Well, I think in many respects we're already there. I mean, I think historians in 100 years will look back and go, the Third World War started in February 2022. You know, there are many elements that are still a phony war. I mean, we saw that at the beginning of World War II, right? That's what we're seeing in the Western Pacific. You know, the Middle East has been at war for some time. It's going to be at war for a long time to come, I think. Russia has made it very clear that it has aggressive designs in the Baltics and in Scandinavia, as well as against Poland and Ukraine. So we're kind of already there, but it's a mindset that we need to have. And it's something that our Western politicians really have to contemplate hardly, because they're going to have a different balance of domestic and foreign investment in their budgets. It's starting to turn in some, but I don't think there's widespread understanding or agreement in the political class of the need to do that.
Well, on that note, I think, General Mick, it's been a real pleasure talking to you for Frontline today.
No, it's always a pleasure to be with you. I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Oh, no doubt we'll do that as soon as we possibly can. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like to be amongst the first to get exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership at the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs, or read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.